Hi guys, and welcome to Quiet History Vault tonight. You arrive just a little too late. A thin layer of ash drifts slowly through the air, settling softly on your shoulders, light as snow but warmer than it should be. You brush it away without thinking, only to notice how quiet everything is. No footsteps, no distant voices, not even the sound of wind. Just a stillness that feels unnatural. You take a slow breath, and there is a faint bitter taste in the air. It lingers longer than expected. You pause, because something here does not quite make sense, and the more you notice, the clearer it becomes. If you were truly standing here, you would not have time to understand it. You probably would not survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to share your location and local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights. Flow straight into the story. The ash keeps falling around you. Not heavily, not dramatically. Just enough to dust the frozen ground in pale grey streaks. It gathers along broken fence rails and clings to the edges of a collapsed roof nearby. The settlement around you seems abandoned at first glance, though that is not entirely true. Frontier places in winter often feel abandoned even when full of people. Everyone stays indoors. Doors remain shut tight. Windows glow faintly behind cloth coverings. Smoke curls from chimneys like tired ghosts trying to escape the cold. But tonight something has changed. You walk carefully through the narrow path between cabins, your boots pressing into snow that squeaks with bitter cold. That sound alone tells you plenty. Old frontier settlers knew the sharper the squeak beneath your feet, the colder the temperature. Modern weather apps give cheerful little snowflake icons. The 19th century gave you frozen toes and the possibility of quietly losing a finger because you forgot your gloves while carrying water. A common historical reality of frontier winters was how dangerous fire became inside wooden settlements. Cabins stood close together. Roofs dried by constant smoke could ignite frighteningly fast. One overturned lantern or one chimney spark could erase half a town before dawn. Tonight, you arrive after exactly that kind of disaster. The smell confirms it. Burned pine, wet wool, ash soaked into snow, and underneath all of it, another smell, damp blankets. You notice them hanging everywhere now, over fences, across shattered wagon wheels, draped across porch rails stiff as boards, thick wool blankets darkened by melted snow. Some still steam faintly in the freezing air. Others have frozen solid in crooked shapes, like strange sculptures abandoned by exhausted hands. Wet blankets mattered more than almost anything during frontier winters. They warmed, protected, smothered sparks, blocked drafts, wrapped livestock, carried children, and occasionally saved entire cabins from burning down. They were survival itself, just much heavier and smellier than survival tends to appear in movies. You approach one cabin still standing near the edge of the settlement. Its chimney leans slightly sideways, though smoke still curls weakly upward. Someone survived here. The door opens before you knock. A woman peers out, her face pale from exhaustion and firelight. She studies you for a moment without surprise. Frontier people rarely wasted energy acting shocked. If a stranger appeared during winter, you either helped them or buried them later. Very practical thinking. "You standing there freezing for decoration?" she asks softly. You step inside. Warmth reaches you in uneven waves. Not comfortable warmth. Frontier warmth. The kind that heats one side of your body while the other side still wonders whether death might be simpler. The cabin smells overwhelmingly of damp wool drying near the hearth. Blankets hang from rafters overhead, dripping occasionally into pans placed beneath them. Everywhere you look, blankets, one wrapped round a sleeping child near the wall, one spread beside the fire with scorch marks along its edge, one folded beneath an old man's head, one nailed over a drafty corner where wind still sneaks through the logs. You can hear the wet fabric crackling softly as ice melts from its fibres. The woman returns to the fire and kneels beside a blackened kettle. Her husband sits nearby, rubbing soot from his hands with snow. Nobody speaks loudly. After disaster, people often become strangely quiet, as if the world itself might snap if handled carelessly. You settle onto a rough stool while your boots thaw slowly beside the fire. Outside, darkness presses tightly against the cabin walls. Inside, everyone smells faintly like smoke. One lesser-known frontier custom involved soaking blankets deliberately before hanging them near doors during fires. Wet wool resisted sparks far better than dry fabric. Some families survived cabin fires by wrapping themselves in soaked blankets and running through flying embers into snowbanks outside. Scholars continue debating how widespread this practice truly became across isolated settlements, but enough diary accounts survive to suggest it happened more often than people realise. The old man near the hearth finally speaks. "Lost 3 cabins," he murmurs. The woman nods once. "Could have lost the whole row." You glance toward the wet blankets hanging overhead and begin understanding why every surviving piece of cloth matters so much tonight. Blankets on the frontier were expensive. A good wool blanket could cost serious money in isolated regions. Some families passed them down through generations almost like furniture or silverware. A damaged blanket during winter was not merely inconvenient, it could become catastrophic. And these blankets are all wet now. That is the strange misery of freezing American winters. Dry cold is survivable. Wet cold crawls directly into your bones with the patience of a tax collector. Once wool became damp from snow, melted ice, or human breath trapped overnight, sleeping beneath it turned into an entirely different experience. You are about to learn that experience very personally. The woman hands you a blanket from beside the hearth. It feels heavy immediately. Not soaking, just damp enough to notice. You pull it around your shoulders anyway because your body wants warmth more than comfort. The wool smells faintly of smoke and old sheep. Honestly, not ideal. Yet after a few moments you feel heat gathering beneath it, trapped close against your coat. Then you notice something else. The blanket edge touching your neck feels icy cold. A little line of melted snow hidden deep in the fabric presses against your skin like winter itself, whispering directly into your spine. Your shoulders tense automatically. Every frontier settler knew this feeling. The unpleasant shock of discovering your blanket was wetter than expected halfway through the night. The husband chuckles softly after seeing your expression. First time. You nod. He pokes the fire carefully with an iron rod. Long winter ahead. Outside, the ash continues drifting silently across the snow, while inside the cabin the damp blankets steam slowly into darkness, carrying with them the smell of survival, exhaustion, and another sleepless frontier night waiting patiently beyond the firelight. The blanket grows heavier across your shoulders as the night deepens. Not dramatically heavier, just enough that you begin noticing it every time you shift your weight. Damp wool has a peculiar talent for making itself known. It presses down with quiet determination, carrying the chill of melted snow inside its fibres long after touching the fire. The cabin settles around you in small sounds. Wood creaks softly in the rafters. Water drips from hanging blankets into dented pans below. Someone coughs once near the far wall. The fire pops, sending a brief spray of sparks upward that makes everyone glance toward the hanging laundry overhead with immediate suspicion. Nobody on the frontier ever trusted sparks. The woman rises quickly and adjusts one blanket farther from the flames. Her movements are practiced and sleepy at the same time. The kind of motions repeated so often the body performs them automatically. You notice her hands are rough and reddened from winter work. Every knuckle looks cracked by cold air. A plain historical truth about frontier cabins is that most were terribly insulated. popular paintings love showing cheerful log homes glowing warmly in snowstorms. Actual cabins often leaked wind through gaps in the walls, around doors, beneath floors, and sometimes directly through the roof. Chinking helped, certainly. Mud, moss, clay, scraps of cloth stuffed between logs, but winter always found weaknesses eventually. And tonight winter seems especially determined. You feel it creeping across the floorboards. Cold air moves low through the room like invisible water, pooling around boots and ankles. The fire keeps the centre warm enough for comfort if you stay close. But the corners of the cabin belong entirely to January. The child near the wall stirs in sleep. His blanket slips slightly aside, and immediately the woman crosses the room to tuck it back around him. She pauses afterward, resting her palm briefly against his forehead. Not feverish, just cold. Everyone here measures temperature constant, where with fingertips, with breath, with instinct. Modern people own thermostats. Frontier families owned anxiety. The husband removes his boots beside the hearth with a tired groan. Steam rises faintly from his socks. You can smell wet leather warming near the fire, sharp and earthy. He stretches his feet toward the coals and flexes his toes carefully. Better wet than frozen, he mutters. You're not entirely convinced. Your own blanket has begun warming nicely near your chest, but the outer layers remain clammy. When you touch the wool near the edge, your fingers come away cool and damp. The sensation is strangely exhausting. Moisture steals heat steadily, patiently, hour after hour. Some historians note that wool remained popular precisely because it could still insulate even while wet. Linen and cotton became far more dangerous in freezing weather once soaked. Wool at least continued trapping some warmth. Unfortunately, some warmth and comfort are very different concepts. The old man near the fire shifts beneath his own blankets and begins speaking quietly without opening his eyes. Snow came through roof once, he says. Nobody responds immediately. Apparently this requires no introduction. North Dakota winter. 1856, maybe 7. Woke up with snow right across my chest. The husband nods sympathetically. Happened to my brother in Wisconsin. You sit silently listening while the firelight flickers across damp wool hanging overhead like ghostly curtains. One curious frontier tidbit involved people sleeping with heated stones wrapped inside blankets during especially brutal cold spells. Families placed rocks near fires, wrapped them in cloth, and tucked them near feet before bed. Done carefully. It worked reasonably well. Done carelessly. It produced burns or accidental fires. Frontier life often involved choosing between two unpleasant outcomes and selecting whichever seemed less fatal. The wind outside strengthens suddenly. You hear it pushing against the cabin walls with a low rushing sound. One blanket hanging over the doorway stirs inward gently. Immediately colder air snakes through the room. Everyone notices. Nobody comments. The woman simply rises again and presses the hanging blanket tighter against the crack beside the doorframe. Frontier households use blankets for everything. Beds, coats, curtains, draft stoppers, emergency bandages, crude baby carriers, funeral coverings. A really committed blanket on the frontier had several career paths. You pull yours tighter around your shoulders and move closer to the hearth. The warmth feels wonderful for perhaps 30 seconds. Then the blanket begins steaming slightly against your coat. That is the strange misery of damp winter bedding. Heat wakes the moisture hiding inside it. You warm one part while another grows wetter. Sleep beside another person and condensation collects from breathing overnight. Hang blankets too close to the fire and melted frost turns them damp again before drying fully. Frontier winters trapped families in endless little cycles of moisture. The husband notices you studying the blankets overhead. Never get fully dry this time of year, he says quietly. The woman snorts softly. Not till spring if God feels generous. Outside, snow brushes faintly against the cabin walls. Inside, the air thickens with warmth, dampness, and smoke. You notice the windows now, or rather the places where windows attempt to exist. Thin coverings stretched across openings barely larger than your head. Some frontier cabins used greased paper instead of glass, because proper windows cost too much or broke too easily during travel. The result allowed weak light inside while keeping out only part of the cold. Imagine spending an entire winter one strong gust away from indoor weather. Historians still dispute exactly how common severe winter misery became across different frontier regions, because surviving diary accounts vary wildly. Some settlers described cozy evenings around roaring fires. Others recorded frost forming on blankets while sleeping indoors. Much depended on money, location, experience, and simple luck. Luck mattered constantly. A good chimney mattered. A dry roof mattered. And above all, dry blankets mattered. The child coughs again. This time the sound lingers slightly longer. The old man opens his eyes at once. Everyone listens to the silence afterward. That silence tells them more than the cough itself. Is breathing steady? Is there another cough coming? Does the child settle back into sleep or begin shivering? At last the room relaxes again. The woman returns to her stool beside the hearth and finally allows herself a long, slow breath. She looks exhausted in the firelight. Frontier women often slept lightly through winter nights because someone always needed watching. Fires died. Babies cried. Wind changed direction. Water froze indoors. Illness appeared without warning. Real frontier sleep was rarely deep. You shift beneath your blanket again, trying to find a dry fold against your neck. Eventually you succeed. The warmth settles around you more comfortably now, though the heavy smell of wet wool remains impossible to ignore. Smoke drifts lazily upward toward the rafters. Snow whispers against the roof, and little by little, beneath hanging blankets and weary silence, the freezing American night stretches onward around the cabin, while the damp wool keeps holding both warmth and winter impossibly close together. The fire burns lower sometime after midnight, not enough to panic anyone. Not yet. But you notice the change immediately because the cold begins returning in careful little steps. First your fingertips cool beneath the blanket, then the tip of your nose, then the strange creeping chill along the floor reaches farther toward the hearth. The cabin feels smaller now. Darkness presses closer beyond the firelight, turning hanging blankets into shadowy shapes swaying gently from the rafters. Water still drips now and then from thawing wool. Each drop lands with tiny hollow taps inside the pans below. Tap, tap, tap. Frontier winter nights often sounded like leaking roofs even when no rain existed for hundreds of miles. You pull the blanket tighter around yourself again, though it resists slightly. Damp wool folds awkwardly, heavy with absorbed moisture. The fabric scratches faintly against your chin. You understand now why people on the frontier treasured soft quilts whenever they could afford them. Rough wool kept you alive. Comfort was another luxury entirely. The husband stands and adds 2 more logs to the fire. Everyone watches automatically. That is another forgotten reality of winter cabins. Fire never became background scenery. You monitored it constantly because your entire night depended on those flames behaving properly. Too little fire and everyone froze. Too much fire and the cabin itself might burn while you slept. The logs catch slowly. Orange light spreads across the room again, revealing frost gathered along the lower edges of the walls. You stare at it in surprise. Tiny crystals shimmer where cold air seeps between the logs. The husband notices your expression and gives a tired smile. Better inside than outside, he says. Technically true, emotionally unhelpful. A well-documented historical fact from frontier diaries describes people waking to frost on blankets indoors during severe winters. Breath alone added moisture to cabin air overnight. Once temperatures dropped low enough, That moisture froze directly onto walls, bedding, and clothing. Imagine sleeping inside a freezer while someone occasionally tossed smoke at you for comfort. The child near the wall whimpers softly in sleep. The woman crosses over immediately, kneeling beside him beneath the hanging blankets. You watch her tuck the damp wool more carefully around his shoulders, layering one blanket atop another despite the moisture trapped inside them. Warmth mattered more than dryness now. That was the terrible compromise. You ask quietly whether the blankets ever truly dried in weather like this. The woman glances back toward you. Maybe near March, she says. The old man chuckles weakly from his corner. If the Lord remembers us by then. Outside, the wind moans briefly against the chimney. Snow brushes across the roof in soft scraping waves. The entire cabin sounds surrounded by frozen ocean surf. You settle deeper beneath the blanket and notice the smell changing slightly as the wool warms. Smoke remains strongest, but underneath it lingers wet earth, old lanolin, and something faintly sour from trapped moisture. Frontier cabins developed entire climates of their own during winter. Damp fabric, dry wood smoke, animal scents tracked indoors on boots, soup simmering somewhere endlessly in the background, human breath thickening the air night after night. Modern homes politely separate smells. Frontier cabins introduced them all to each other and locked the door. One unusual winter practice involved settlers sleeping in caps or scarves, specifically to prevent frost from forming in their hair overnight. Men, women, and children alike sometimes wrap their heads indoors during extreme cold. A person waking with frozen hair sounds ridiculous now, though probably less ridiculous than central heating would sound to them. You touch the blanket near your chest. Warm. Then the edge near your elbow. Cold again. The difference is astonishing. The blanket behaves almost like weather itself. Pockets of heat trapped beside hidden dampness. Every movement rearranges the temperatures. Frontier sleep required constant adjustments through the night, tugging wool higher, rotating to warmer spots, curling closer toward others, protecting fingers from open air. Historians continue debating how much romantic nostalgia later generations attach to frontier hardships. Some descendants describe pioneer winters as noble tests of character. Others quietly admitted they were miserable beyond modern imagination. Both can be true at once, of course. Human beings have always loved turning suffering into inspirational family stories once enough time passes. The husband sits again beside the fire and begins repairing a torn glove using thick thread and terrible lighting. His wife watches the child while absent-mindedly rubbing warmth back into her hands. Nobody wastes time here. Even exhaustion performs chores. You notice now how many blankets hang near the ceiling. More than seemed possible earlier. Some patched repeatedly with mismatched fabric. Some singed dark along the edges. One clearly stitched together from smaller pieces entirely. A strong wool blanket represented months of work or serious expense. Families repaired them endlessly because replacing one during winter could become impossible. Remote settlements often waited months for supply wagons once snow-blocked roads. The fire crackles loudly. Everyone glances upward again. There is something almost comical about frontier life. Every object keeping you alive also threatened to kill you eventually. Fire warmed the cabin but might burn it down. Blankets protected against cold but trapped dampness and sickness. Snow provided water once melted but blocked travel and buried livestock. Even the walls leaked cold while trying their best to stop it. The old man shifts painfully beneath his blankets and begins speaking again, his voice rough with sleep. Once slept beside a wall so cold my blanket froze solid against it. The husband nods. I believe it. No, the old man mutters, eyes half closed again. You don't. Silence follows except for the soft hiss of melting frost dripping from wool overhead. You imagine lying beside a cabin wall all night while moisture from your breath slowly freezes into your bedding. Every turn of the body pressing against damp, cold fabric. Every uncovered finger aching immediately. No electric heater, no dry pajamas from a closet, just darkness, smoke, and stubborn endurance until dawn finally arrived. The child coughs once more, softer this time. The woman relaxes slightly. Outside, wind sweeps across the settlement, carrying ash from burned cabins into the snow. Somewhere beyond the darkness, a dog barks briefly, then stops. The sound fades quickly beneath the storm. You close your eyes for a moment beneath the damp blanket. The wool presses heavily against your shoulders now, warm in some places, freezing in others. Smoke drifts lazily through the cabin air. Frost gleams faintly along the logs. And little by little, you begin understanding how frontier winters transformed something as ordinary as sleeping into a nightly contest between warmth, moisture, exhaustion, and the slow, patient cold creeping always beneath the quilts. The night stretches onward with the stubborn slowness only winter can manage. You begin to understand why frontier people measure darkness differently. Modern nights are soft things. Electric lights glow. Radiators hum politely. Someone somewhere is always awake ordering soup through an app. But here, beyond the firelight, darkness feels physical. It presses against the cabin walls with cold hands. The blankets overhead sway slightly whenever wind squeezes through hidden cracks. One of them drips directly onto the floor beside the hearth. The woman notices immediately and moves the pan beneath it without even looking fully awake. Her body remembers these routines long before her thoughts catch up. You suspect she has been doing this for years. Steam rises faintly from the wool nearest the fire. That steam carries a smell unlike anything modern houses produce. Wet sheep, smoke, melted snow, human sleep. You breathe it in and suddenly realize every piece of fabric in this cabin has absorbed months of winter living. The blankets do not merely cover the family. They remember the family. The husband finally finishes repairing his glove and holds it toward the flames to inspect the stitching. Firelight flickers across his tired face. He cannot be much older than 40, yet the frontier ages people like weather ages fence posts. The old man near the wall has drifted asleep again, though every so often he shivers beneath his blankets hard enough to shake the stool beside him. You pull your own wool covering closer and instantly regret moving. Cold air slips beneath the fabric. That is the great trick of frontier bedding. Once warmth gathered beneath the blankets, disturbing it felt like opening a bank vault full of stolen heat. Families learned to sleep carefully, almost strategically. Sudden movement invited misery. A widely accepted detail from pioneer journals describes entire households sleeping in layers of clothing during winter, including coats, socks, scarves, and caps indoors. Privacy mattered far less than warmth. Many cabins contained only one room anyway, which meant several generations snoring together beside one fire while pretending not to notice. Romantic paintings rarely include grandfather coughing 3 feet away while someone's boot dries beside the soup kettle. The child near the wall wakes briefly. You hear the soft rustle of blankets before his small voice whispers into the darkness. "Ma!" The woman turns instantly. "I'm here. Cold." She rises again, takes another damp blanket from a nearby peg, and layers it atop him carefully. The wool is not dry. You can tell from the stiffness in the folds, but the extra weight helps trap more heat. The boy sighs and settles back down. You watch the mother remain kneeling beside him for a moment longer, rubbing warmth into his shoulder through the blankets. One curious piece of frontier folklore claimed sleeping beneath especially heavy quilts protected against nightmares because evil spirits supposedly struggled to press through thick fabric. Whether people genuinely believed this or simply enjoyed an excuse for extra bedding during January remains wonderfully unclear. Outside, the wind changes direction. You hear it immediately. The cabin hears it too. A low whistle begins near the roofline, followed by tiny bursts of drifting snow slipping through somewhere overhead. Not much, just enough to dust the edge of a hanging blanket white before melting into the wool. The husband looks upward with exhausted annoyance. There it is again. He stands, grabs a small scrap of cloth, and climbs onto a stool near the wall. You watch him stuff the cloth into a narrow crack between logs, where icy air spills inward steadily. Frontier carpenters fought endless wars against tiny openings. Cold never needed a large invitation. Some surviving accounts from northern settlements mention water buckets freezing solid indoors overnight during severe cold snaps. Imagine waking thirsty and discovering your drinking water has become furniture. You begin appreciating why the family keeps the kettle near the fire, constantly simmering. The woman returns to her seat at last and wraps herself in a blanket of her own. Unlike the others, hers appears patched almost beyond recognition. Dark squares of old fabric overlap across the wool like pieces of a map. You ask quietly how old it is. She smiles faintly. Older than my marriage. The husband snorts softly. Better stitched too. That earns him a look powerful enough to survive another century. The fire settles lower again. Orange light pulses across the damp cabin walls while smoke curls lazily upward toward the rafters. You notice the ceiling beams glistening slightly from trapped moisture. Even the wood itself seems wet with winter. Researchers continue discussing how much frontier illness worsened because of indoor dampness and smoke exposure during long winters. Families sealed cabins tightly against freezing air, but doing so trapped moisture, soot, and sickness together in crowded spaces. A cozy cabin often doubled as a very small respiratory experiment. The old man suddenly coughs hard enough to wake himself. Everyone glances over. He waves one hand irritably. Still alive, unfortunately, the husband murmurs. The old man points a crooked finger toward him without opening his eyes. Boy, I survived 3 winters in Minnesota before you learned to shave. Mistake on Minnesota's part. The woman shakes her head gently while hiding a smile. Even here, with damp blankets steaming overhead and frost growing quietly along the walls, humor survives. Frontier families relied on humor almost as much as firewood. Without it, the winters would have stretched forever. You listen carefully now. The cabin contains dozens of tiny sounds. Blankets dripping, firewood settling, wind scratching the roof, soft breathing beneath quilts, someone shifting slowly on straw bedding, the faint crackle of drying wool near open flames. Every sound feels magnified by darkness. You realize suddenly how exhausting true cold becomes. Not dramatic life-threatening cold, just endless low winter cold, the kind that keeps asking small things from your body hour after hour. More heat, more effort, more patience. Your blanket has finally grown warm across most of its surface now, though certain damp patches still press icy against your elbows. You understand why settlers sometimes woke during the night simply to reposition bedding near the fire. No part of winter sleeping remained passive. Outside, ash from the burned cabins continues drifting through the frozen settlement, while inside the surviving cabin the hanging blankets steam quietly above tired faces, carrying the smells of smoke and melted snow deep into the long sleepless hours before dawn. The child's breathing softens again, blending back into the rhythm of the cabin. You notice how everyone listens for that rhythm without seeming to. Frontier families became experts at sleeping with one part of the mind awake. A baby coughing, a horse kicking outside, a chimney drawing badly, a sudden silence where wind should be. Any of it could pull a household from sleep instantly. Tonight the room settles into temporary peace. The fire burns steadily. Snow brushes gently against the roof, and the hanging blankets continue releasing faint curls of steam into the smoky air. The woman leans back against the wall at last, exhaustion heavy across her face. She closes her eyes but never quite falls asleep. One hand remains stretched toward the child beside her beneath the blankets. You sit quietly near the hearth and watch the firelight move across the cabin ceiling. Shadows ripple through the hanging wool overhead, making the blankets look almost alive. The husband notices you staring upward. Looks worse near morning, he murmurs. You ask what he means. breath freezes into them. He points toward the rafters. Wake up and half the room feels wet. That simple sentence somehow feels colder than the weather outside. A detail often mentioned in frontier memoirs is how entire families shared body heat during winter nights. Children slept packed together beneath layers of quilts and wool. Infants were sometimes tucked between adults for warmth. Privacy became secondary to survival once temperatures dropped low enough. You glance toward the child, now bundled beneath several blankets near the wall. Only part of his nose remains visible. He resembles a small sleeping hill made entirely of wool. Another child lies nearby. Older, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, curled tightly beneath patched quilts. Her boots rest beside the fire, drying slowly. One sock hangs from a chair back, stiff with frozen moisture. You realize suddenly how much frontier winter depended on drying things. Dry boots, dry gloves, dry blankets, dry firewood. Every object crossing the cabin threshold arrived carrying snow or ice. Every person became a walking weather system. The cabin spent all winter trying unsuccessfully to dry the world around it. The old man wakes again and reaches slowly for a tin cup beside his bedroll. Water sloshes faintly inside. He studies it suspiciously. Not frozen yet, he mutters. Give it time, the husband replies. One odd little practice from isolated settlements involved warming children's beds with hot potatoes wrapped in cloth before bedtime. Potatoes held heat surprisingly well, and were less likely than heated stones to scorch blankets accidentally. Somewhere in history, an exhausted parent discovered this entirely by accident and probably felt very clever afterward. The wind outside eases slightly now, without the constant rushing sound against the walls. Smaller noises inside the cabin become clearer. You hear wool fibres crackling faintly as damp blankets dry near the fire. The sound resembles tiny footsteps moving through cloth. The woman opens her eyes again and studies the blankets hanging overhead. Need turning, she says quietly. The husband sighs like a man personally betrayed by fabric. Still, he stands. Together they begin rotating the hanging blankets closer to the fire one by one. The heavier pieces require both of them. Water drips steadily onto the floor as frozen edges thaw. You help with one. The weight surprises you immediately. A wet frontier blanket feels less like bedding and more like carrying a tired sheep through a snowstorm. The wool pulls heavily against your arms. Cold moisture seeps through your sleeves almost at once. The husband notices your expression and laughs softly. Now imagine sleeping under 3 of them. You're beginning to understand why frontier people often woke stiff and exhausted even after full nights indoors. The blanket nearest the fire smells strongest of smoke. Not fresh smoke from tonight's fire. Old smoke soaked deep into the fibres over years. You suspect no blanket on the American frontier ever truly smelled clean after its first winter. Scholars remain divided on exactly how much domestic labour increased during especially severe winters, because many surviving records were written by men who rarely described household work in detail. Yet scattered diary entries from women paint a relentless picture of hauling water, drying clothes, tending fires, caring for sick children, and constantly fighting dampness inside tiny cabins. The woman beside the hearth certainly looks familiar with that battle. She wrings melted snow from one blanket edge into a bucket. Froze on the line earlier, she says. You imagine blankets hanging outdoors in sub-zero weather, stiffening into icy boards while snow falls across them, then hauling them back inside still half frozen because there is no choice. The older child suddenly stirs awake. For a moment she looks confused by the darkness. Then she sees the fire and relaxes immediately. Morning, she whispers. Not even close, says the old man. The girl groans softly and disappears deeper beneath her quilts. A modern person might check a phone after waking unexpectedly. Frontier children checked whether they still had eyebrows. The husband finishes repositioning the blankets overhead and returns to his stool near the fire. He rubs warmth back into his hands slowly. Could be worse, he says. The woman raises an eyebrow. How? He considers this carefully. Roof could be gone. She nods reluctantly. Fair point. That strange frontier optimism appears again. Not happiness exactly, more like negotiated survival. If the cabin remained standing, the fire still burned, and everyone continued breathing. Then conditions counted as manageable. Outside, the ruined settlement lies silent beneath drifting ash and snow. Burned cabins crouch dark against the frozen ground, while surviving chimneys send thin ribbons of smoke into the sky. Inside, warmth gathers weakly around the hearth once more. The blankets overhead drip less now. Steam curls upward from their heavy folds while the family settles back toward uneasy sleep. You pull your own damp blanket tighter beneath your chin and feel the familiar mix of warmth and chill pressing together across your skin. And gradually, surrounded by steaming wool and breathing bodies, you sink deeper into the peculiar half-comfort of a frontier winter night where even rest feels like work. Somewhere deep in the night, a sound outside changes everything. It is not loud, just a dull thump beyond the cabin wall, followed by the faint creak of something shifting under snow. Yet every adult in the room wakes instantly, eyes open, heads lift. Even the old man straightens beneath his blankets with surprising speed. Husband turns toward the door immediately. The woman whispers, "What was that?" Nobody answers because nobody knows yet. You listen carefully. For a moment there is only wind and the soft crackling of the fire. Then comes another sound, a low uneasy noise from outside. Not human. Animal. The husband stands and reaches for his coat hanging beside the hearth. "Horse," he mutters. His wife closes her eyes briefly like someone already tired of the next hour before it begins. This was the hidden labour of frontier winters. Sleep never truly belonged to you. Livestock needed checking constantly during storms and freezing temperatures. Horses tangled in lines, cattle wandered through damaged fencing, chickens froze in poorly sealed sheds. Every strange sound outside carried consequences, and tonight the blankets hanging near the fire are not the only ones in danger of freezing solid. The husband pulls on stiff boots still damp from melted snow earlier. You hear the leather creak sharply. He grabs a lantern from beside the door and checks the flame with practiced fingers. "You stay put," the woman tells him. "Planning to—" "Last time you said that, you disappeared for 2 hours. That drift near the barn was taller than me." The old man grunts softly. "Still shorter than your common sense. Despite the cold, despite the exhaustion, tiny sparks of humour continue flickering through the cabin like stubborn embers." The husband wraps a heavy wool blanket around his shoulders before opening the door. Not dry. Nothing is dry anymore, but thick enough to block wind. The moment the door cracks open, icy air rushes inside hard enough to sting your face. Snow swirls through the gap. The lantern flame trembles wildly. And suddenly you understand why frontier people dreaded nighttime winter chores. The cold outside does not feel natural. It feels personal. The husband steps into darkness and pulls the door shut behind him. Instantly the cabin shrinks again around the remaining warmth. The woman moves closer to the fire while listening toward the outside. One hand twists nervously in her blanket. A familiar reality across frontier settlements was that livestock often represented a family's survival during winter. Losing a horse or milk cow could devastate households financially. Animals required feeding, water, shelter, and constant monitoring during storms. There were no convenient indoor barns glowing with electric lights. Just snow, darkness, and exhausted people stumbling outdoors half asleep. You hear the husband's boots crunching faintly beyond the cabin. Then silence. The older child wakes again. "For outside." "For a minute," her mother says gently. The girl nods sleepily and pulls blankets tighter around herself. Even children understood these nighttime interruptions. They grew up measuring storms by how many times adults had to leave the cabin before dawn. One strange little account from frontier Iowa described settlers bringing weak newborn lambs directly into cabins during blizzards, and wrapping them in old blankets beside the fire. Imagine waking half asleep to discover a sheep sharing your winter bedding arrangement. Honestly, compared to some modern roommates, not the worst possibility. The woman rises suddenly and crosses toward the hanging blankets. "He'll need a dry one," she murmurs. You almost laugh at the phrase. Dry one? None of these blankets are truly dry anymore. Some are merely less wet than others. Still, she searches carefully among them, choosing the thickest wool piece hanging nearest the hearth. Steam rises faintly from it as she folds it over her arms. Outside, the wind strengthens again. Snow rattles against the walls in quick bursts. The chimney moans softly overhead. Somewhere beyond the cabin comes the distant sound of a horse snorting sharply in distress. The woman stiffens. "Fence," the old man says quietly. "How can you tell?" Heard that sound before. He settles back beneath his blankets with the weary confidence of someone who has survived too many winters to waste energy explaining them. You wait. Time stretches strangely during winter nights. Minutes feel longer when measured by cold and worry instead of clocks. The fire pops loudly. A shower of sparks rises upward toward the hanging blankets. Immediately the woman grabs the poker and beats the sparks down before they reach the wool. Her movements happen so fast you realize this fear never truly leaves frontier households. Fire and blankets remained trapped in permanent dangerous partnership. Researchers still disagree on how many frontier cabin fires began accidentally from drying clothes and bedding too near open flames, largely because isolated settlements kept incomplete records. But enough accounts survived to suggest nearly every family feared it constantly. At last footsteps crunch outside again. The latch lifts. The husband stumbles through the doorway, trailing wind and snow into the cabin. Frost clings white across his beard and eyebrows. The blanket around his shoulders has become crusted with ice along one edge. "Gate blew open," he says breathlessly. The woman hands him the warmer blanket immediately. "Horse." "Fine now." He strips off the frozen outer blanket and hangs it near the fire with a heavy wet slap. Snow melts instantly onto the floorboards beneath it. The cold follows him inside for several minutes afterward, spreading through the cabin despite the fire. You feel it creeping beneath your own blankets again. The husband kneels beside the hearth, holding his hands toward the flames. They shake slightly now that the immediate danger has passed. "Nearly lost the lantern," he mutters. The old man opens one eye. "Nearly lost your fool head too." The husband grins tiredly. Still attached. The woman wraps the warmer blanket tighter around his shoulders without speaking. You notice her hands linger briefly against his back before returning to her own seat near the wall. Outside, wind continues sweeping across the settlement, burying tracks almost as quickly as they appear. Snow gathers against burned cabins. Fences disappear slowly beneath drifting white. Inside, another soaked blanket hangs steaming beside the fire, while exhausted bodies settle back toward uneasy sleep, carrying the cold of the outdoors with them into the long frozen hours before morning. The cold comes back inside with him, not all at once. It lingers in the air after the door closes, spreading slowly through the cabin like spilled water finding cracks in the floorboards. Snow melts from the husband's boots beside the hearth. Tiny puddles gather beneath them, reflecting the firelight weakly. His blanket steams heavily now. The woman hangs it near the flames while shaking her head. "You smell like the stable." "Stable smells better than the outhouse." That earns a sleepy laugh from the old man. You notice the husband's hand still trembling slightly as he holds them toward the fire. Fingertips redden painfully while warmth returns. Frontier winters punished exposed skin immediately. A few minutes outside during deep cold could leave cheeks numb and fingers stiff enough to fumble lanterns or latches. The child near the wall opens one eye. "Horse okay?" "Horse is smarter than me," the husband replies. "Most creatures are," mutters the old man. The little boy seems satisfied by this and disappears back beneath the blankets. Outside, wind moves across the settlement in long hollow sighs. You imagine the burned cabins standing dark beneath drifting snow. their ruined roofs catching moonlight somewhere beyond the storm. The woman returns to her seat near the hearth and begins rubbing warmth into her husband's shoulders through the blanket. Neither speaks for a while. They simply sit together, listening to the fire. The cabin smells even damper now. Wet wool, wet leather, wet snow melting from coats. Everything slowly drying and slowly failing to dry at the same time. You glance toward the ceiling where blankets still hang from rafters, like oversized sleeping bats. One drips steadily near the chimney. Another curls slightly at the edges from too much heat. A practical truth from frontier trading routes was that buffalo robes often became prized winter bedding across colder regions of America. Fur traders, trappers, and settlers used them heavily because thick hides trapped warmth remarkably well. Unfortunately, once wet, they grew monstrously heavy and developed smells capable of challenging human optimism itself. The husband finally speaks again. "River crossing froze early one year," he says quietly, staring into the fire. The old man groaned softly. "Don't tell that story." "Why not?" "Because you always skip the foolish parts." The husband smiles faintly. There were many foolish parts. You settle deeper beneath your own blanket while he talks. Trading run north of the Missouri. Thought we had enough supplies. Then sleet started. He shakes his head slowly. Everything got wet. Blankets, coats, powder. Couldn't dry a thing for days. The woman watches him carefully now. Clearly she's heard this story before. Felt like sleeping inside a river. He continues. That image stays with you. Sleeping inside a river, because that is the true misery of wet winter blankets. Not dramatic freezing, not cinematic snowstorms, just endless dampness pressing against your body hour after hour until warmth itself feels exhausted. The fire crackles louder for a moment as sap bursts inside one of the logs. Everyone glances upward automatically. Again that strange frontier instinct. Sparks always mattered. One curious winter superstition claimed blankets falling unexpectedly during the night, warned of approaching storms or bad luck. Considering most frontier blankets hung from rafters beside smoky fires in overcrowded cabins, gravity alone probably explained much of this paranormal activity. Still, at 3 a.m, while snow beats the walls, even practical people begin negotiating with ghosts. The older child wakes once more and sits upright beneath her quilts. Her hair sticks wildly in every direction. "Need water," she mumbles. The woman reaches for the kettle beside the hearth and pours a small cup carefully. Steam rises into the cold cabin air. The girl drinks slowly while wrapped entirely in blankets except for one pale hand. You notice how no one leaves bedding casually. Every exposed arm seems to invite immediate cold. The husband finally removes his boots fully and holds one upside down over the floor. Water pours out. You stare. He notices. Snow got through the stitching. The old man snorts. Those boots were old when Lincoln had black hair. Lincoln never had good hair. Neither do you. The conversation drifts lazily between them while the storm continues outside. Their voices remain low and rough with exhaustion, yet comforting somehow. Human warmth of another kind. Historians continue examining how frontier communities adapted regional winter habits from indigenous groups and experienced trappers, particularly regarding layered clothing and winter shelter techniques. Some settlers learned quickly, others ignored useful knowledge until weather educated them personally, which tends to be a memorable teacher. The woman reaches upward and tests one hanging blanket with careful fingers. Still damp. You can tell by her expression she expected the answer already. Nothing truly dries tonight. Not the blankets. Not the boots. Not even the walls. Condensation glimmers faintly along the logs nearest the ceiling where heat rises and meets trapped cold. Every breath added moisture to the room. Every kettle steaming near the fire. Every snow-covered coat brought indoors. The cabin spent winter inhaling dampness faster than it could ever exhale it. You shift slightly beneath your blanket and feel one cold patch against your side. Instant discomfort. The dampness there is gathered near a folded seam in the wool. You try repositioning the blanket carefully without releasing too much trapped heat. Frontier sleep involved constant small negotiations like this. Too much movement lets cold air inside. Too little movement leaves you lying against icy fabric. No wonder everyone looks permanently tired. Outside. The horse snorts again somewhere beyond the walls. Then comes the distant creaking of trees shifting under wind and ice. The sounds feel enormous against the surrounding silence. The husband leans back at last and closes his eyes beside the fire, not fully asleep, just resting carefully. The woman drapes another blanket across his legs and settles beside him once more. The children sleep bundled nearby like small islands beneath layers of wool and patchwork quilts. And above them all, the damp blankets continue steaming softly through the frozen American night, while the fire burns low and the storm keeps searching patiently for every weakness in the cabin walls. The cabin grows quieter as the night drifts toward its coldest hours. You can feel the change without needing a clock. Fires burn lower, wind settles into longer steady breaths outside, and every surface in the room seems to cool at once, as though winter itself has finally leaned fully against the walls. The husband sleeps lightly in his chair now, chin resting near his chest beneath the blanket his wife wrapped around him earlier. One boot still sits upside down beside the hearth, drying slowly. Steam no longer rises from it. That feels oddly ominous. The old man snores faintly from his corner. The children sleep bundled together under layers of damp quilts and wool, their breathing soft beneath the crackling firelight, and still the smell of wet blankets fills the room. It has become part of the air itself now, smoke and dampness woven together so completely you can no longer separate them. You shift carefully beneath your own blanket and instantly discover another cold patch along the edge. The wool there feels clammy against your wrist. Frontier bedding had a remarkable ability to hide tiny pockets of misery inside otherwise comfortable warmth. The woman remains awake, not fully alert perhaps, but awake enough. Her eyes drift repeatedly toward the children, toward the fire, toward the hanging blankets near the rafters. Winter teaches people to monitor many things at once. Then comes the cough again. The younger child curls tighter beneath the blankets and coughs twice into the darkness. Small sounds, but sharp enough to freeze the room more effectively than any wind. The woman rises immediately. You watch her kneel beside him, one hand resting gently against his chest through the quilts. "Hush now," she whispers. The boy breathes unevenly for a moment before settling again. Still, she doesn't move away. An unfortunate but common feature of frontier winters was how easily illness spread through cabins during cold months. Families crowded together indoors beside weak ventilation and damp bedding. Smoke irritated lungs already strained by freezing air. Children especially suffered from coughs, fevers, pneumonia, and infections that today might be treated quickly, but then carried terrifying uncertainty. You notice the woman studying the boy's face in silence. Not panicking, just measuring. Parents on the frontier became unwilling experts at watching symptoms. Colour in the cheeks, warmth in the skin, breathing during sleep. A single bad cough could haunt an entire household for weeks. The old man opens one eye, still breathing steady. Yes, good. He closes his eye again almost immediately. Apparently that counts as optimism around here. One lesser-known winter remedy involved rubbing goose fat or bear grease onto chest before bed, in hopes of easing coughs and protecting against cold air. Whether it truly helped remains questionable, though it certainly guaranteed everyone smelled interesting around the fire. The woman reaches toward a small shelf beside the wall and takes down a jar wrapped in cloth. She opens it carefully. Even from where you sit, a sharp herbal smell drifts through the cabin. The boy makes a face while half asleep. "No." "Yes," she replies softly. She places a tiny amount onto a spoon and coaxes him into swallowing it with warm water from the kettle. He grimaces dramatically before collapsing back into blankets, like a tiny tragic poet betrayed by medicine. The husband wakes briefly. How bad? Just coughing. He nods once and drifts back towards sleep almost instantly. Exhaustion works quickly on the frontier. Outside, snow whispers across the roof again. You notice frost spreading farther along the walls now, tracing pale silver lines between the logs. The fire still burns, but winter continues winning small victories around the edges of the room. Some historical records from northern settlements describe people sleeping with scarves wrapped across their mouths and noses to warm the air before breathing it overnight. Imagine explaining to a modern mattress company that your luxury bedtime experience includes accidental indoor frostbite prevention. The older child wakes enough to mumble sleepily toward her mother. Is he sick? Just cold. Everybody's cold. That answer hangs in the room for a moment because it feels true in more ways than one. The woman brushes hair gently from the girl's forehead. Go back to sleep. The child obeys immediately, vanishing once more beneath heavy quilts. Researchers continue discussing how much emotional strain frontier winters placed on isolated families, especially women caring for children through long seasons of illness and confinement. Diaries from the period sometimes reveal exhaustion hidden beneath practical daily descriptions. Fires tended, laundry dried, child coughed all night, snow again. Simple sentences carrying enormous weight. The hanging blankets overhead sway faintly as warm air rises from the fire. Drip, drip. The water pans beneath them are nearly full now. You realize the cabin itself is slowly melting winter indoors. Snow carried in on boots, ice thawing from coats, breath freezing then softening again, every corner damp with survival. The husband suddenly shifts in his chair and mutters something half asleep. Check the mare. You already did, the woman says quietly. He grunts and settles again. Even dreams on the frontier apparently involve chores. The old man coughs roughly into his blankets and clears his throat. Boy'll be fine, he says toward nobody in particular. You don't know that. Know enough. There is no false certainty in his voice. Just the weary realism of someone who has watched many winters come and go. Some children survived coughs. Some did not. Frontier families understood that truth far too well. You pull your blanket higher against your shoulders again. The damp wool feels warmer now from your own body heat, though the edges remain cold. You can smell smoke deep in the fibres each time you breathe. Somewhere beneath that smell lingers another scent too. Wet wood, perhaps, or old snow. The fire settles lower. Orange embers pulse softly beneath blackened logs while shadows deepen around the room. The woman finally returns to her seat, though she keeps watching the child through half-closed eyes, and slowly, beneath steaming blankets and creeping frost, the little cabin continues holding itself together against sickness, cold, exhaustion, and the long freezing darkness waiting patiently beyond the walls. By the time the darkest part of night arrives, the cabin feels suspended between sleeping and waking. Nobody rests completely. The husband dozes in fragments beside the hearth. The woman watches the children through half-closed eyes. Even the old man seems to snore with suspicion, as though prepared to argue with winter itself if necessary. Outside, snow continues falling across the settlement. Inside, dampness continues winning its quiet war against every blanket in the room. You notice it most clearly now along the lower edges of the quilts nearest the floor. Moisture gathers there from melted snow tracked indoors earlier. The wool feels heavier than before, sagging slightly where water has soaked deeper into the fibres. The fire crackles softly, but the warmth no longer reaches every corner. The cold has settled into the cabin completely now. Not violent cold, persistent cold, the kind that slips beneath blankets and waits patiently against your skin. You curl tighter inside your wool covering and feel the rough fabric scratching faintly against your cheek. It smells strongly of smoke tonight, almost sweet in places where heat from the hearth has warmed the damp fibres. Then another sound drifts through the room. Drip, drip, drip. One of the hanging blankets has begun leaking steadily into the pan beneath it. The water level there rises little by little, catching reflections from the firelight. You stare at it for a while. An entire cabin quietly melting overnight. One practical reality of frontier travel was that wagon covers rarely protected families fully during sleet or freezing rain. Water seeped through canvas seams, soaked bedding, froze overnight, and turned migration into a moving misery. Many pioneers arrived at settlements with blankets already damp before winter even properly began. The husband wakes suddenly with a sharp breath. For a moment he looks confused by the darkness. Then he remembers where he is and rubs his face tiredly. What time? The old man answers without opening his eyes. Coal. Apparently that counts as a valid measurement. The woman reaches toward the kettle again and pours warm water into a cup for her husband. Steam curls upward into the dim cabin air. He drinks slowly while staring into the fire. You notice his blanket has begun drying unevenly near the edges closest to the hearth. Some parts look almost comfortable now. Others remain visibly damp and dark. That was another hidden frustration of frontier winters. Blankets dried in patches, one section warm and soft, another freezing against your legs. You could never fully trust your own bedding. A strange winter habit from certain wagon camps involved people sleeping wrapped in buffalo robes, while placing boots under their blankets to keep the leather from freezing solid overnight. Imagine drifting towards sleep beside someone carefully spooning their footwear for survival purposes. The younger child coughs once again. Softer now. The woman relaxes slightly at the sound. Funny how relief sometimes arrives disguised as noise. You glance toward the door where another blanket hangs across the frame blocking drafts. Frost sparkles faintly along its lower edge. Every time wind presses against the cabin, the wool shifts inward slightly like something breathing from the other side. The older girl wakes enough to whisper toward you unexpectedly. You ain't asleep. Neither are you. Apparently. No, you whisper back. Too cold. A little. She nods knowingly from beneath her quilts. Floor's colder near morning. Then she immediately falls back asleep, leaving you with that cheerful information. Accounts from frontier settlements often mention children becoming remarkably adaptable to harsh conditions simply because they knew nothing else. Sleeping 3 to a bed, wearing damp socks, waking with frost inside windows. To them, this was not historical hardship. It was Tuesday. The fire settles lower again. The husband notices at once and adds another log carefully. Sparks leap upward in a brief orange swirl. Everyone watches the blankets overhead. The sparks fade harmlessly. Only then does the room relax again. Researchers continue exploring how much fear shaped ordinary domestic routines on the frontier. Fire, sickness, storms, isolation, starvation, frozen livestock. Modern people imagine danger as dramatic moments. Frontier families experienced it more like background weather humming quietly through daily life. You hear the wind shifting outside once more. This time it carries another sound with it. Voices, faint and distant beyond the storm. The husband stands immediately and moves toward the door. The woman rises too, concern flashing across her face. Neighbour, she whispers. The voices come again, muffled beneath the wind. The husband opens the door carefully. Cold air crashes inward. Snow swirls through the doorway while lantern light flickers outside. 2 figures stand bar the drifted path wrapped entirely in blankets and heavy coats. One carries a bundle against their chest. A child, perhaps. They hurry inside quickly as the husband shuts the door behind them. Instantly the cabin becomes crowded with new cold, new snow, new dampness. The visitors peel away frozen blankets stiff with ice along the edges. Snow falls across the floorboards beneath them. The woman gasps softly at the bundle. It is a little girl wrapped in soaked quilts. Cheeks flushed bright red from cold. Fire went out, the visitor says breathlessly. That explains everything. The old man mutters something under his breath involving poor chimney maintenance and divine disappointment. The newcomers crowd near the hearth while steam begins rising heavily from their blankets. The little girl shivers violently beneath the wet quilts wrapped around her. Without hesitation, the woman grabs two of the driest blankets hanging nearby and kneels beside the child. "Get those off her." The room suddenly fills with movement. Wet blankets dropped near the fire, boots kicked aside, hands rubbing warmth back into tiny fingers. The cabin grows hotter and colder at once, crowded now with snow-soaked fabric and exhausted bodies carrying winter indoors with them. And as the firelight flickers across steaming wool and tired faces, you realize frontier survival rarely happened alone. One cabin's warmth often became another family's rescue before dawn. The little girl cannot stop shivering. Even beside the fire, even wrapped now in thicker blankets, her small body trembles in sharp, uneven bursts. Melted snow drips steadily from the quilts removed moments earlier. One lands beside your boot with a tiny splash. The newcomers look exhausted beyond words. A man and woman perhaps not much older than the couple already living here, though winter has carved hard lines into every face in the room. Their coats glisten wet near the shoulders where snow melted during the walk through darkness. The woman of the cabin kneels beside the child and rubs warmth carefully into her hands. "How long without fire?" the visiting mother swallows before answering. "Since midnight, maybe." The old man mutters softly into his blankets. "Too long." That sentence settles heavily over the room. A cabin losing heat during deep winter could become dangerous frighteningly fast. Frontier fires required constant tending. Sparks escaped. Chimneys clogged. Wood ran damp. One mistake or one gust of wind sometimes meant an entire family waking inside freezing darkness. The husband adds more wood to the hearth while the visiting father removes his gloves slowly. His fingers look painfully pale near the tips. You realize now that every blanket in the room matters even more than before. More people means more cold carried indoors, more damp clothing steaming near the fire, more bodies fighting over limited warmth. And yet nobody hesitates. The older child shifts over automatically to make space for the little girl beside the quilts. "Here," she whispers sleepily. The little girl nods without speaking and disappears beneath the blankets beside her. One overlooked truth from frontier communities was how often neighbours depended on one another during winter emergencies. Cabins stood isolated geographically, but socially they survived through cooperation, shared fires, shared food, shared labour, shared blankets when necessary. Outside, snow keeps falling with quiet determination. Inside, the cabin air grows thicker and damper by the minute. Wet coats hang beside wet blankets now. Steam curls upward from nearly every corner near the hearth. The smell becomes overwhelming. Smoke, wool, melted snow, mud from boots, human exhaustion. You suspect historians sometimes underestimate how much frontier life smelled like damp laundry. The visiting father finally holds his hands near the flames and winces as feeling returns. "Creek froze over solid," he says quietly. "Wind took the chimney draft wrong after." The husband nods in understanding. No further explanation needed. One strange frontier habit involves sleeping with dogs beneath blankets during severe cold spells, because animal warmth genuinely helped preserve heat. Entire families occasionally shared sleeping space with cats, dogs, or even weak livestock during blizzards. Modern mattress advertisements rarely include now with emergency goat compatibility. The little girl coughs weakly beneath the quilts. Immediately both women look toward her. You notice how every cough still changes the room. The visiting mother brushes damp hair gently from the child's forehead. She was wet near through by the time we walked here. The woman beside her nods grimly. Wet cold frightened frontier families more than dry snow. Dry cold punished slowly. Wet cold climbed directly through clothing into muscle and bone. The old man pushes himself upright slightly. "Need warm broth." "No broth left," the husband replies. "They're not water and stubbornness." That your cure for everything worked so far. The husband cannot argue with results. The kettle soon passes between tired hands while steam fogs the colder air above the fire. Everyone drinks slowly. Even the children wake enough for a few warm sips before sinking back beneath the blankets. You notice the cabin feels warmer now, despite the added cold brought inside earlier. Not physically warmer, perhaps, just fuller. More breathing, more voices, more life gathered against the storm. Some scholars continue debating how isolated frontier settlements balanced hospitality with survival during harsh winters. Taking in stranded travellers consumed precious firewood, bedding, and food. Yet refusing help during storms carried moral weight many communities took seriously. In places where everyone eventually needed rescue, generosity became practical insurance. The husband hands the visiting father another blanket from beside the hearth. The man laughs weakly. "Thought ours were wet." "These are wet too," the husband replies. "Ah." The visitor nods. Then they're luxury blankets. That earns tired smiles around the room. Frontier humour again? Dry wit in a very damp world. The hanging blankets overhead drip less now as heat slowly reaches them. Some edges have nearly dried completely near the fire, turning stiff and scratchy instead of clammy. Others remain soaked deeper inside the folds. You begin understanding why settlers rotated bedding constantly through winter nights. No blanket stayed comfortable for long. The fire dried one section while another collected condensation from breath and cold walls. The older girl whispers something quietly to the younger visitor beside her. "What?" "You can put your feet under my blanket." The little girl hesitates. "They're cold." "Mine too." That apparently settles the matter. A documented detail from wagon train diaries describes children often sleeping crosswise together, beneath shared quilts to conserve warmth more effectively. Practicality shaped every sleeping arrangement. Comfort remained a distant secondary concern. The visiting mother finally leans back against the wall with visible exhaustion. "Thank you," she says softly. The woman beside her shrugs gently. Next storm might be us. No drama in her voice. Just frontier mathematics. The firelight flickers across the crowded cabin while snow continues brushing against the roof outside. Wet blankets hang from every possible beam and peg now, steaming gently into the smoky air. You realise there is almost nowhere left to step without touching damp wool. Still, no one complains. Not truly. The little girl has stopped shivering so violently now. Her breathing steadies beneath the blankets shared with the older child. The husbands sit near the hearth, warming hands beside one another in silence. The women watch the children while exhaustion slowly drags at their eyes. And through it all, the cabin holds together somehow. Too crowded, too damp, too cold around the edges, yet alive with the quiet, stubborn warmth of people refusing to let winter take more than it already has. The crowded cabin settles slowly into a new rhythm. More breathing fills the darkness now. More blankets rustle softly whenever someone shifts beneath them. The little girl rescued from the cold sleeps at last beside the older child, both wrapped together under layers of quilts and damp wool near the wall. The fire burns low but steady. Outside, the storm finally seems tired. Wind still moves across the settlement, though softer now, brushing snow against the cabin in long whispering strokes instead of sharp bursts. Somewhere beyond the walls, horses stamp occasionally in their shelter. The husband stares into the embers quietly. Then he says something unexpected. "Old Elk would laugh at us." The old man opens one eye. "He laughed at everybody. Still right most times." The visiting father nods slowly in agreement. You notice the women listening now too. "Old Elk, you gather, is not a joke but a person. Or was?" The husband pokes gently at the fire. "Said we built too close to the wind line." The old man snorts. He did say that. A deep historical reality often ignored in frontier mythology is how much survival knowledge already existed long before settlers arrived. Indigenous communities understood regional winters intimately. Wind patterns, shelter placement, animal behaviour, snow conditions, insulation methods. Some settlers listened and adapted. Others confidently ignored generations of hard-earned expertise with spectacular results. The husband gestures vaguely toward the walls. Old Elk told us snow would drift hardest here. The visiting father gives a weary smile. And now snow drifts hardest here. The old man coughs roughly into his blankets. Turns out he knew weather better than church maps. That line lingers warmly in the room. You imagine the settlement years earlier. Cabins rising beside frozen earth. Settlers choosing locations based on rivers, trees, convenience. Meanwhile, someone already familiar with the land quietly noticing where winter moved, where wind cut deepest, where cold settled longest after sunset. One lesser-known detail from frontier accounts describes certain indigenous winter sleeping systems using layered hides, elevated bedding, and carefully managed airflow that often kept interiors warmer and drier than many settler cabins. Moisture control mattered enormously during freezing weather, though newcomers frequently underestimated this until their blankets turned into cold sponges by midnight. You glance upward again toward the hanging wool. The blanket still steams softly in the firelight. The cabin remains damp despite every effort. The visiting mother studies the ceiling thoughtfully. Wish we'd built farther into the trees. The woman beside her nods. Less wind, maybe. More wolves, mutters the old man. There is always a trade somewhere. Frontier life rarely offered perfect solutions, only different categories of inconvenience. The husband shifts in his chair and rubs one tired hand across his face. Old Elk slept with heated sandstones under his bedding. The older girl opens sleepy eyes. Really? Wrapped in hide. He nods toward the fire, kept warmth longer than bricks. The child seems deeply impressed by this information. Honestly, so are you. Researchers continue examining how often frontier communities quietly borrowed winter practices from indigenous neighbours, while later pretending those methods were entirely their own invention. Survival tends to encourage cultural flexibility, even amongst stubborn people. The little rescued girl stirs beneath the blankets and presses closer against the older child beside her. Neither fully wakes. Shared warmth happens automatically now. You notice the fire beginning to shrink again. Immediately, 3 adults glance toward it at once. That constant awareness never stops. The visiting father stands and adds another log carefully while brushing snowmelt from his sleeve. Water darkens the floorboards beneath him. Every object brought inside tonight continues thawing slowly. Boots, blankets, coats, even the visitors themselves. One curious account from northern trading regions mentioned travellers sleeping beneath overlapping layers of fur and wool so heavy they required help standing afterward. Frontier bedding occasionally resemble a very determined avalanche. The old man suddenly points toward the door blanket. Draft coming through again. He is right. The hanging wool near the entrance stirs gently inward where cold air leaks around the frame. Frost has formed along part of the lower edge. The husband rises with a sigh and stuffs another scrap of cloth into the crack beside the latch. Cabin's shrinking, he mutters. No, says the old man. Winter's expanding. That feels uncomfortably accurate. The woman near the children finally leans back against the wall and closes her eyes for a few precious moments. Her hand still rests protectively atop the blankets, covering both girls. You wonder how many frontier mothers spent entire winters sleeping in fragments, no longer than 10 minutes at a time. The smell inside the cabin deepens again as wetter blankets nearer the fire continue steaming. Smoke clings to your own blanket now so strongly you suspect the scent may follow you for the rest of your natural life. Not entirely unpleasant, though. Just relentless. Outside, snow begins slipping from one section of the roof with a soft rushing sound. Everyone pauses briefly to listen. The cabin holds. Good enough. Some historians continue debating how quickly settlers adapted psychologically to frontier winters versus merely enduring them season after season. Endurance and adaptation are not quite the same thing. A person may survive terrible cold for years, while still secretly hating every frozen sunrise. The husband settles back beside the fire again. Old Elk said wet blankets kill slower than pride. The visiting father laughs quietly. Sounds like him. The old man closes his eyes once more. Smart man. Silence drifts gently through the cabin after that. The children breathe softly beneath shared quilts. The blankets overhead sway faintly in the rising heat, and little by little, surrounded by damp wool and fading embers, the crowded winter cabin carries onward through the freezing darkness while remembered knowledge from older winters lingers quietly between the walls. At some point before dawn, the storm finally traps the world completely. You sense it first through the silence. The wind fades almost entirely. No more scraping gusts across the roof. No more rattling against the walls. Snow has piled high enough outside to muffle everything beneath thick frozen weight. The cabin feels buried. You sit very still beneath your blanket, listening to the strange quiet surrounding the room. Even the horses outside seem distant now, their occasional movements softened by deep snow. Inside, the fire glows low and red. The crowded cabin has become warmer from shared body heat, yet somehow damper too. Moisture clings everywhere, on the walls, on the hanging blankets, along the edges of coats drying beside the hearth. The air itself feels wet. You breathe in smoke and wool and steam all tangled together. The old man opens his eyes slowly and studies the ceiling. Storm packed us in. The husband glances toward the door. How deep, you think? Deep enough nobody's visiting now. The visiting father gives a tired laugh. Good. We already used tonight's hospitality. A well-established fact from frontier settlements is that severe blizzards could isolate families for days at a time. Snowdrifts blocked doors, buried paths, and erased roads entirely. Some cabins disappeared beneath snow, almost to the roofline after major storms. During those stretches, families survived entirely on whatever firewood, water, and food remained inside. You suddenly understand why every blanket in the room hangs drying so carefully. Nothing can be wasted now. The younger child coughs again, though weaker than before. His mother checks him automatically with one cool hand against his forehead. Still no fever. The entire room seems relieved by this without saying so directly. One fascinating winter custom from isolated prairie communities involved people hanging quilts across interior spaces to create smaller heated sleeping areas inside cabins. Essentially, they built tiny fabric rooms within larger cold rooms. Human beings will invent remarkably creative architecture once sufficiently annoyed by January. The husband stands slowly and moves toward the door. His wife looks up immediately. "Where are you going?" "Just checking drift." "You checked before, and snow kept happening." "Fair argument." He lifts the latch carefully. The moment the door opens, pale snow spills inward across the threshold. Not falling from the sky, sliding sideways from a drift packed against the cabin itself. Everyone stares. "Well," says the old man softly, "that's unpleasant." The husband pushes the door wider with effort. A wall of snow nearly reaches halfway up the opening outside. Cold blue darkness presses beyond it. "No wonder it got quiet," the visiting father murmurs. The husband shuts the door again quickly, sealing the room back into warmth and dampness. "We're staying put till daylight." Nobody argues. Researchers continue examining how prolonged winter isolation affected frontier families emotionally during harsh seasons. Days blurred together beside dim fires, while storms erased contact with neighbouring cabins. Some diaries describe boredom. Others reveal anxiety bordering on despair. Most simply list practical tasks because practicality was easier to write about than fear. The woman near the children adjusts another blanket around the little rescued girl. The wool there feels nearly dry now near the surface. Almost. But not fully. Never fully. That is the constant truth of frontier winter bedding. Human breath alone kept reintroducing moisture into every layer overnight. Entire families sleeping close together beneath heavy blankets slowly created their own weather systems. You shift beneath your blanket and feel warmth trapped beautifully near your chest. Then your foot brushes a colder damp section near the edge. Immediate regret. The old man notices your expression and grins faintly. Found the wet spot. You nod. Always one waiting somewhere. There speaks a man with experience. The fire snaps sharply as a pocket of moisture bursts inside one of the logs. Sparks leap upward briefly toward the hanging blankets overhead. Every adult reacts instantly. The husband grabs the poker. The women glance upward. The visiting father half rises from his seat. Then the sparks fade harmlessly. The room relaxes again. That reflex fascinates you now. Frontier people monitored fire the way sailors monitor waves during storms. Constantly. Automatically. Because survival depended on noticing danger before danger fully arrived. A curious bit of frontier folklore claimed that if frost formed in feather bedding indoors, winter intended to stay longer than expected. Whether anyone genuinely predicted seasons this way, or simply enjoyed blaming blankets for bad weather, remains delightfully uncertain. The older girl wakes again and stares sleepily toward the ceiling. Feels crowded. That's because we're all alive, says the old man. She considers this. Good point. Then promptly falls asleep again. The husband returns to the hearth and begins turning another blanket near the fire. Water drips steadily from the lower edge into an already overflowing pan. Need another bucket, he mutters. The visiting father hands him one without speaking. Small acts now. Tiny practical cooperation holding the night together. A number of surviving winter accounts mention settlers waking to find blanket edges frozen, where they touched cabin walls during storms. Moisture from breathing travelled through the wool and crystallized against the cold logs. Imagine reaching for extra warmth at dawn and discovering your bedding has quietly attached itself to architecture. Outside, the snow packed against the cabin thickens further. You can almost feel the weight surrounding the walls, yet strangely, the buried silence also makes the room feel safer somehow, hidden from the wind at last. The children sleep deeply now beneath layered quilts and shared warmth. The adults drift between conversation and exhaustion, and overhead, damp blankets continue steaming beside the low red fire while the snowbound cabin settles deeper into the frozen stillness before dawn. The fire burns dangerously low sometime before morning. You notice it first in the children. They begin curling tighter beneath the blankets, drawing knees closer against their chests. The little rescue girl presses deeper beneath the quilts beside the older child. Even asleep, bodies recognize fading warmth. The cabin cools by slow degrees, not dramatic enough for panic, just enough that everyone wakes a little more. The husband leans forward heavily in his chair and studies the embers. Red glow pulses weakly beneath collapsing logs, while ash gathers thick across the hearthstones. Woodpile's shrinking, he murmurs. The visiting father rubs tired eyes. Storm still deep outside. Deep enough. The old man grunts beneath his blankets. Always burns faster near dawn. That feels true about more than fire somehow. A frequent hardship at isolated military posts and frontier forts involves shortages of dry firewood during severe winters. Soldiers stationed far from supply lines often slept under damp government-issued blankets inside poorly heated quarters, while winds swept through cracks in walls and roofs. Some forts recorded indoor temperatures cold enough to freeze water beside sleeping men. You imagine rows of exhausted soldiers wrapped in wet wool beneath weak lantern light, trying unsuccessfully to ignore numb feet. Suddenly the crowded little cabin feels almost luxurious by comparison. Almost. The husband finally rises and crosses toward the stacked firewood near the wall. He pauses beside it longer than expected. You already know why. Not much left. The logs there look smaller now than earlier in the night. Damp, too. Snow must have blown into the woodpile before being carried indoors. He chooses carefully before placing 2 pieces onto the fire. One catches slowly. The other hisses with trapped moisture. The old man sighs dramatically. Wet wood? Excellent, but perhaps tomorrow we eat frozen soup for celebration. No soup left, the visiting father reminds him. Then frozen disappointment. The women ignore them entirely while checking blankets around the children. One odd frontier rumour claimed army blankets issued during certain winters became so stiff from dampness and frost that soldiers could supposedly prop them upright against walls by morning. Whether this happened regularly or merely became one of those exaggerated stories told by cold, miserable men remains uncertain, though, honestly, it sounds believable enough. You shift beneath your own blanket and discover the warmth has faded noticeably near your legs. The wool there feels colder now, almost slick with lingering dampness. You rub your feet together instinctively beneath the fabric. No immediate improvement. Frontier nights required patience more than comfort. The visiting mother notices one hanging blanket beginning to smoke faintly near the fire. Immediately she stands and pulls it farther away from the flames. The smell sharpens at once. Scorched wool. Everyone wrinkles noses. The old man points accusingly toward the blanket. Burn that one and we all freeze politely together. The husband nods, trying to avoid that. That delicate balance never stops. Too near the fire and blankets smoulder. Too far away and they stay wet. Frontier winter life often resembled an elaborate argument, with physics conducted entirely while sleep deprived. Outside, buried snow presses heavily against the cabin walls now. The world beyond the door feels unimaginably distant. You realize nobody has mentioned leaving again until daylight. Perhaps nobody wants to imagine the cold waiting outside. Several documented reports from frontier forts describe soldiers sleeping fully dressed in winter, including belts and boots, because emergency alarms or sudden weather changes could force them outdoors instantly. Removing boots risked discovering frozen leather impossible to pull on quickly before dawn. The husband glances toward his drying boots near the hearth, as if remembering exactly that problem. The older girl wakes slowly and pushes tangled hair from her eyes. Smells burnt. Only a little. Her mother says, comforting. The old man chuckles into his blankets. Children on the frontier developed a strange practical humour early. The younger boy coughs once again, though weaker than before. His breathing sounds clearer now at least. The woman listens carefully for several moments before finally relaxing. You realize the entire room has spent hours unconsciously listening to that child breathe. The fire begins strengthening at last as drier sections of wood catch properly. Orange light spreads wider through the cabin again. Shadows retreat slightly from the corners. Warmth follows slowly. You can almost feel everyone easing at once. Researchers continue examining how chronic exhaustion shaped daily life during frontier winters. Interrupted sleep from cold, livestock care, fire tending, storms, and overcrowding created constant fatigue. Yet diaries from the period often describe work continuing regardless because survival allowed very little scheduling flexibility. The visiting father leans back against the wall and closes his eyes briefly. Never thought I'd miss summer mosquitoes. The husband laughs softly. You say that now. I mean it. No, you don't. Probably true. One curious winter practice at remote forts involved soldiers stuffing newspaper or straw between blankets for extra insulation during severe cold spells. Human beings will absolutely sleep beneath crunchy reading material if sufficiently desperate. The hanging blankets overhead drip less now. Some finally feel nearly dry near the surface when the women test them with careful fingers. Yet deeper folds remain cool and damp inside. Moisture hides stubbornly in thick wool. The cabin itself seems sleepy now, despite the crowded conditions. Conversations shorten, movements slow. Even the fire crackles more softly as dawn creeps gradually closer somewhere beyond the snow-packed walls. You settle deeper beneath your blanket again and notice the warmth returning little by little around your legs. Not perfect warmth. Frontier warmth, uneven, smoky, hard-earned. And through the dim, frozen hours before sunrise, the crowded cabin continues breathing quietly beneath steaming blankets, while outside the buried settlement waits motionless under snow. The smell reaches you before the danger fully does. A sharp, bitter scent cutting through smoke and damp wool. Burning fabric. The visiting mother notices it first. Blanket, she whispers sharply. Everyone moves at once. The husband lunges toward the hearth while the woman grabs the smoking edge of a hanging wool blanket with bare hands and yanks it backward. Tiny orange embers glow along one corner where sparks must have landed unnoticed moments earlier. The old man is suddenly wide awake. Outside, he snaps. The husband beats at the smouldering patch with another blanket while ash scatters across the floorboards. The room fills instantly with the ugly, choking smell of scorched wool. Children wake in confusion. The little rescue girl begins crying softly beneath the quilts. The firelight flickers wildly across frightened faces and dripping blankets overhead. Then, just as quickly as it began, the danger passes. The glowing embers die. Smoke curls upward lazily. Everyone freezes for a moment, listening carefully. No spreading fire. No crackling walls. Only breathing. The husband exhales slowly and lowers the half-burned blanket to the floor. "Well," says the old man, "that could have been memorable." No one laughs immediately. A grim but familiar reality across frontier America was that house fires remained among the greatest winter dangers. Families dried clothes, boots, and bedding near open flames constantly because they had little alternative. Entire settlements vanished after sparks caught dry roofs or hanging fabric during cold, windy nights. You stare at the blanket now lying across the floorboards. One blackened corner smokes faintly. The woman kneels beside it, examining the damage with exhausted irritation rather than panic. Apparently this blanket has offended her personally. "Still usable," she mutters. "Of course it is. Frontier people repaired everything." One curious historical anecdote tells of settlers rubbing snow directly onto smouldering blankets or clothing during cabin fires because water buckets sometimes froze too solid overnight. Imagine waking at 3 a.m, throwing snow at your bedding while trying not to burn alive. Very rustic, very authentic. The children settle slowly once they realize the cabin remains standing. The older girl rubs her eyes sleepily. "Thought we were burning." "Not tonight," says the husband. The old man points toward the damaged blanket. "Tomorrow maybe if your aim stays poor." The husband ignores him and rehangs the wool farther from the fire this time. You notice how carefully everyone watches the blankets now. Every spark from the hearth suddenly seems larger. Every crackle from burning wood draws eyes upward automatically. Fear lingers after near disasters. Outside, snow remains packed high against the walls, sealing the cabin into its little pocket of heat and smoke. The world beyond feels impossibly distant. Inside, the dampness grows thicker again from all the movement near the fire. Steam rises from blankets shifted too close to the hearth during the commotion. Your own wool covering smells more strongly of smoke now than ever. The visiting father pours a little water from the kettle into the pan beneath the scorched blanket corner just to be safe. It hisses softly against the fabric. A number of frontier households reportedly kept dedicated fire blankets near hearths and chimneys specifically for smothering sparks. Thick wool worked surprisingly well when damp. Of course. The challenge involved keeping those same blankets from becoming the source of the problem moments later. The younger boy coughs once from beneath the quilts. The woman immediately checks him again. Still no fever. You suspect she has repeated this motion 1,000 times through winter nights. The old man finally settles back beneath his blankets with dramatic grumbling. Never trust sparks after midnight. That a saying asks the visiting father? It is now. The cabin relaxes slowly again. The husband sits heavily beside the hearth and rubs soot from his hands. Black streaks mark his fingertips where he grabbed the smoking wool. The visiting mother passes him a cloth silently. Researchers continue discussing how frontier families balanced practical fire safety with basic survival needs during severe winters. Drying clothes and bedding remained essential, especially after storms. Yet every item placed near flames increased risk. There were no smoke detectors. Only tired people waking suddenly to strange smells in darkness. You glance upward again. Blankets everywhere, hanging from rafters, spread across chairs, wrapped around sleeping children, stuffed against cracks near the door. The entire cabin depends on wool while simultaneously fearing it. One entertaining little superstition claimed sparks jumping unusually high from the hearth predicted visitors before dawn. Considering the cabin already contains extra guests tonight, perhaps the fire feels accomplished enough. The older girl whispers sleepily toward the little rescued child beside her. Told you this cabin's exciting. The younger girl gives a tiny, exhausted laugh beneath the blankets. You can barely see their faces now. Just tangled hair and quilt edges lit softly by the fire. The husband reaches for another piece of wood and hesitates again beside the shrinking pile. Dawn still has not arrived. That realization settles quietly over the room. The women notice too. Nobody comments. Instead, the visiting father stands and begins breaking apart one damaged wooden crate near the wall for extra kindling. Practicality wins over sentiment instantly. The fire catches the dry pieces quickly. Warmth spreads once more. Not luxurious warmth, not safe warmth exactly. Just enough to keep the darkness at bay. Outside, snow presses heavily against the buried cabin while the burned settlement sleeps beneath drifting white and cold stars hidden somewhere beyond the storm clouds. Inside, damp blankets steam gently overhead once again, carrying the sharp, lingering scent of smoke while exhausted people drift carefully back toward uneasy sleep beside the fire they both depend on and fear. The cabin smells permanently singed now, even after the scorched blanket stops smoking. The scent lingers in the damp air beside the stronger smells of wet wool and wood fire. It settles into everything. Your blanket, the children's quilts, the coats hanging near the door. Frontier winters had a way of preserving odours almost as thoroughly as they preserved misery. The fire burns brighter for the moment thanks to the broken crate feeding it. Orange light spreads warmly across the crowded room. Frost along the lower walls begins melting into tiny shining droplets. The husband notices immediately. Wool's sweating now. The visiting father nods. Better than freezing. That depends where it drips. A practical observation. Moisture never truly disappears inside the cabin. It only changes location. The women have finally drifted into shallow sleep beside the children. Their heads rest against the wall beneath hanging blankets, while one hand from each still touches the quilts nearby. Even unconscious, they continue guarding warmth. You watch the little rescued girl breathe steadily now beneath the shared blankets. Her cheeks no longer look dangerously flushed from cold. The older child sleeps curled beside her like a protective cat. The old man clears his throat softly from beneath his bedding. Swedes used straw. The husband glances over. What? Under blankets, Swedes, kept damp from climbing up. The visiting father grunts thoughtfully. A number of immigrant groups arriving in frontier America brought winter sleeping customs from Europe that adapted surprisingly well to brutal conditions. Scandinavian settlers especially often layered straw mattresses, wool, hides, and quilts strategically to trap warmth and reduce moisture beneath sleepers. Of course, straw came with its own complications, namely bugs. Frontier history contains very few perfect solutions. One peculiar custom among certain immigrant communities involved warming bed linens with heated bricks wrapped in cloth before sleep. Sometimes the bricks cracked unexpectedly from rapid temperature changes, which must have added delightful excitement to already exhausting evenings. The old man continues speaking quietly toward the ceiling. German family north of here used feather beds thick as cows. Warm, asks the visiting father. Warm enough you'd drown turning over. That image somehow feels believable. The husband stretches carefully near the hearth and winces as stiffness catches his back. Wouldn't mind drowning in warmth tonight. The fire crackles softly beside him. You realize dawn must be approaching somewhere beyond the snowbound darkness, though no light reaches the cabin yet. The coldest hours often arrive just before morning, and the blankets know it. Your own wool covering feels heavier now than earlier in the night. Moisture hidden deep inside the fabric has shifted and cooled again while you sat mostly still. Warm near your chest, damp near your knees, one edge almost icy where it touched the floorboards. Frontier bedding constantly renegotiated its relationship with your body. Several surviving accounts from immigrant settlements describe families sewing scraps of old clothing directly into quilts for extra insulation during severe winters. Worn shirts, dress pieces, bits of flannel. Entire histories stitched together into bedding heavy enough to survive January. You glance toward the patched blanket covering the woman nearest the wall. Different fabrics overlap everywhere across it. Dark blue squares beside faded floral cloth. Worn coat lining stitched beside striped cotton. A family history disguised as survival equipment. The visiting father rubs both hands slowly near the fire. "Miss Autumn," he mutters. The husband laughs quietly. "You skipped spring. Spring's mud pretending to be weather." "Fair enough." The old man points lazily from beneath his blankets. "Autumn lies to you. Winter at least honest." That may be the most frontier sentence ever spoken. Outside, snow shifts softly against the buried cabin walls. You hear small sliding sounds now and then from the roof as packed drifts settle lower. Inside, the air has become strangely calm. No more panic. No more rushing for livestock or smothering sparks. Just exhaustion spreading gently through the room. Researchers continue examining how immigrant traditions blended together across frontier settlements during long winters. Food, bedding styles, heating tricks, herbal remedies. Families borrowed ideas constantly because cold cared very little about national identity. The younger boy wakes enough to whisper hoarsely toward his mother, "Water." Without fully opening her eyes, she reaches for the cup beside the hearth and passes it toward him. The motion looks automatic after years of repetition. He drinks slowly beneath the blankets, then pauses, blankets wet. His mother smiles faintly without lifting her head. "They all are." The boy seems satisfied by this explanation and falls asleep again almost immediately. You nearly laugh. Children adapt to astonishing conditions when given no alternatives. One curious frontier belief claimed sleeping beneath too many heavy quilts could trap bad air and cause strange dreams or headaches. Considering most cabins already contained smoke, dampness, crowded breathing, and occasional livestock nearby, the quilts may have been unfairly blamed. The husband stands again and carefully rotates another blanket nearer the fire. This time he watches it constantly while drying. Lesson learned. The visiting father notices a thin pale glow beginning around the window covering near the wall. "Morning, maybe." Nobody celebrates yet. Frontier mornings did not automatically improve anything. Morning merely meant beginning work while cold instead of enduring it half asleep. Still, the room changes subtly at the sight of that faint greyness. People straighten slightly. The old man opens both eyes at last. The children stir beneath blankets. Outside, the buried settlement waits under snow and ash. Inside, damp wool continues steaming gently above weary faces, while the first weak signs of dawn begin creeping toward the cabin through frozen cloth-covered windows. Morning arrives slowly enough to feel uncertain about it. At first the cabin merely changes colour. The darkness near the ceiling softens from black to charcoal grey. Frost along the walls becomes visible again in pale silver streaks. The cloth covering the window glows faintly with weak winter light pressing from outside. Nobody leaps up cheerfully. Frontier mornings in winter inspired caution more than enthusiasm. The husband stands first, joints stiff from sleeping in the chair beside the fire. He stretches carefully beneath the blanket draped over his shoulders and winces. "Feels colder now," he mutters. The old man snorts from beneath his bedding. "That's because you survived the night." A surprisingly philosophical answer before breakfast. The fire has shrunk to deep red embers again. Ash blankets the hearth in thick grey layers while tiny points of orange pulse underneath like hidden eyes. The cabin smells even heavier by daylight. Smoke, wet wool, scorched fabric from the near fire earlier, and beneath it all, the earthy animal scent lingering from coats and boots carried through snow. You realize now how closely frontier families live beside livestock during winter months. Not always directly inside the cabin, though sometimes yes during severe storms or illness, but always nearby. Animals represented heat, labour, food, transportation, survival itself. A commonly recorded feature of frontier settlements was the use of adjoining sheds or lean shelters built close against cabins to trap warmth from livestock during bitter weather. Horses, cows, and goats produced enormous body heat. Clever placement mattered. The husband moves toward the door slowly while pulling on his boots. Still damp, he grimaces immediately. Frozen laces. The visiting father laughs quietly. At least you got laces. One amusing little detail from some frontier accounts involves people sleeping with boots tucked partly beneath blankets to keep leather flexible overnight. Others placed boots upside down near embers so mice would not crawl inside searching for warmth. Imagine beginning each morning by checking whether your footwear contains wildlife. The women wake more gradually. The mother near the children immediately checks the younger boy again before even speaking. His forehead remains cool. His cough seems softer this morning. Relief settles across her face so briefly you almost miss it. The little rescued girl sits upright beneath the quilts and blinks at the crowded cabin in confusion before remembering where she is. "Morning," whispers the older child beside her. "Morning." They both disappear under blankets again almost immediately. Reasonable decision. The husband finally pushes against the door. It barely moves. Packed snow resists from outside with stubborn determination. He shoves harder. A wall of pale drifted snow collapses partly inward across the threshold, carrying sharp cold air into the room. Everyone squints instinctively against the sudden brightness reflecting from outside. The storm has ended. You can tell immediately from the quality of light. Clear cold morning. Possibly the most dangerous kind. The husband steps halfway outside and whistles softly. Drifts near waist high. The visiting father joins him near the doorway. Outside, the settlement lies buried beneath fresh snow and scattered ash from the burned cabins. Chimneys rise from white drifts like lonely black posts. Fences vanish entirely in some places. The world looks peaceful now in the deeply suspicious way winter often does after causing trouble all night. Several period diaries from northern settlements describe snowdrifts covering cabin doors, so completely families exited through windows or dug tunnels outward after storms. Frontier architecture rarely planned elegantly for weather determined to bury the entire neighborhood. The husband shuts the door quickly behind him once he and the visiting father step outside. Cold lingers in their absence. The old man shifts beneath blankets and points lazily toward the hanging wool overhead. Those'll freeze stiff if left too near the draft. The women rise immediately to move them. Again the endless dance with dampness. Dry too slowly and blankets remain cold. Dry too near open air and moisture freezes again. Dry too close to fire and the cabin nearly burns down before dawn. Frontier housekeeping must have felt like managing emotional relationships between dangerous objects. The older girl stretches beneath the quilts and wrinkles her nose. "Cabin smells awful." "Means we're alive," says the old man. "That your answer for everything?" "Nearly." The little rescued child giggles quietly at that. Researchers continue examining how frontier families mentally adapted to chronic overcrowding during winter months. Personal space shrank dramatically once storms trapped people indoors beside drying laundry, livestock gear, food supplies, and shared bedding. Yet many diaries describe companionship during storms with surprising warmth and humour. Perhaps misery truly does become easier when distributed evenly. The women begin turning blankets carefully now that daylight helps reveal damp patches more clearly. Some sections dried nearly completely overnight. Others remain dark and heavy where moisture collected in folds. One blanket crackles faintly with frost near the edge closest to the doorway. The visiting mother touches it and sighs, "Still wet inside." That sentence could summarize half the frontier experience honestly. The younger boy finally sits up beneath his quilts, hair flattened wildly against one side of his head. "Hungry?" The room collectively relaxes. A hungry child sounds healthier already. The woman reaches for the kettle again while the older girl teases her younger companion gently about drooling on shared blankets during the night. The little rescued girl protests sleepily through laughter. Outside, muffled voices drift faintly through the snow as the men begin clearing paths around the buried cabin. Inside, daylight spreads slowly across steaming blankets, tired faces, and frost-marked walls while the long freezing night finally loosens its grip on the crowded little room. The morning light reveals everything winter hid overnight. The cabin looks smaller now somehow. Blankets hang from nearly every beam and chair. Patched wool steaming gently in the pale grey daylight. Boots line the hearthstones in crooked rows. Melted snow has dried into muddy streaks across the floorboards. Frost still clings stubbornly along the far wall where firelight never fully reached. And everyone looks exhausted. Not dramatic heroic exhaustion, just the ordinary frontier kind. The kind carried in slow movements and quiet faces after surviving another freezing night. Outside, the sound of shoveling drifts faintly through the door each time the men force it open against the snow. Scrape, thud, scrape. The older girl watches from beneath her blankets. Think the path's gone. Path's always gone after storms, says the old man. Then how do people find us? They complain until they recognize the cabin. A fair system, honestly. The little rescued child giggles softly at that while clutching a steaming cup between both hands. The warmth has returned colour to her cheeks now. She no longer shivers. The women continue working through the blankets methodically, turning them, shaking them, hanging drier sections outward toward the weak daylight near the window covering. Winter laundry on the frontier never truly ended. It simply paused occasionally to create despair. One well-spotted detail from frontier diaries is that mildew and rot became constant problems in bedding stored or dried improperly during cold wet months. Damp wool trapped moisture deeply. Quilts absorbed breath and condensation night after night. Entire households fought endless quiet wars against mould, lice, smoke, and freezing air all at once. You notice one blanket near the wall carries faint dark stains along the seams. The woman catches you looking. Mildew, she says with tired annoyance. Can it be cleaned? In spring, maybe? Everything waits for spring. The old man shifts beneath his blankets and studies the ceiling thoughtfully. Heard once about a woman in Montana swore ghosts lived in wet quilts. The younger boy looks alarmed immediately. Ghosts. She said they whispered at night. The older girl rolls her eyes. That was wind. Maybe, says the old man, but wind don't usually ask for soup. The little rescue child pulls her blanket tighter around herself. You're making that up. Of course I am. Still, the children glance suspiciously toward the hanging blankets overhead anyway. One odd bit of frontier folklore suggested dreams grew stranger beneath damp bedding because trapped cold air settled into the mind overnight. Considering people often slept beside smoke, coughing relatives, freezing walls, and occasional near fires, strange dreams probably required very little supernatural assistance. Outside, the husband finally stomps back through the door carrying armfuls of snow-crusted wood. Cold air follows him inside in a sharp white burst. Path's half clear, he announces breathlessly. The visiting father enters behind him, shaking snow from his coat. Barn roof held. Good news travels quietly on the frontier. The women immediately make space near the hearth for the wood while the men stack it carefully. Steam rises again from damp coats as they thaw indoors. The cabin briefly smells like outdoors. Fresh snow, cold pine, frozen air. Honestly refreshing after 12 hours of wet wool, the husband notices the children staring at the hanging blankets. What's wrong now? Ghost quilts, says the older girl. The husband closes his eyes briefly. You told them ghost stories before breakfast. The old man shrugs from beneath his bedding. Educational ghosts. Researchers continue discussing how storytelling shaped emotional survival during long isolated winters. Ghost tales, family legends, exaggerated disasters, jokes repeated endlessly beside fires. Entertainment mattered when storms trapped families indoors for days with little distraction beyond chores and each other. The husband removes one boot beside the fire and grimaces. Still wet. The visiting father laughs softly. Everything's wet. True. Your own blanket remains damp along the edges despite hours near the fire. You rub the wool between your fingers and feel the cold moisture hidden deeper inside the fabric. The little rescue girl notices. Ours froze once. Everyone glances toward her. She speaks quietly into her cup. Last winter, blanket got stuck to the wall. The older child immediately sits straighter. Really? Her mother nods from beside the hearth. Cabin fire died low overnight. The little girl continues. Pa had to pull it loose in the morning. The older boy looks horrified and fascinated at once. Did it rip? Only a little. Several historical accounts from northern prairie settlements mention blankets or clothing freezing against cabin walls after moisture from breathing condensed overnight. Imagine waking tangled in your own frozen bedding, while dawn light creeps through icy windows. The frontier really excelled at unpleasant surprises before breakfast. The old man points triumphantly toward the little girl. See haunted blanket. Not haunted, says her mother. Cold ghosts, then. Nobody bothers arguing further. The fire burns stronger now with fresh wood added. Light spreads warmly through the cabin while steam rises from newly thawing coats and blankets once again. The younger boy finally crawls fully from beneath the quilts and immediately regrets leaving the warmth. Floor's freezing. The old man grins. Told you. The boy dances awkwardly across the boards toward the hearth, while everyone laughs softly around him. And for a moment, despite the damp blankets, the smoke-stained walls, the buried snow outside, and the exhaustion hanging over every face, the little frontier cabin feels strangely alive with warmth deeper than the fire itself. As the morning grows brighter, the true condition of the blankets becomes impossible to ignore. Daylight is less forgiving than firelight. What looked merely damp during the night now appears exhausted. Wool hangs unevenly from rafters, heavy with stains, smoke, and lingering moisture deep inside the fibres. Some blankets have stiff white edges where melted frost dried badly. Others show tiny burn holes from sparks survived years ago. One carries a faint smell of mildew strong enough to overpower even the smoke. The woman wrinkles her nose while folding it. Spring can have this one. The older girl peers at the fabric curiously. Why not throw it out? Every adult in the room looks at her. The silence alone answers the question. A practical reality across frontier households was that bedding represented serious labour and expense. Good blankets could not simply be replaced casually after hard winters. Families patched, restitched, aired out, and reused bedding for years beyond what modern people would consider reasonable or hygienic. The husband lifts one blanket toward the weak daylight near the window. Tiny specks drift free from the wool. Dust, perhaps. Ash, perhaps. Something less cheerful, perhaps. He lowers it again immediately. Best not to ask. Wise philosophy. The little rescued girl sneezes suddenly beneath her borrowed quilt. The old man points accusingly toward the hanging blankets. There's your ghosts. Her mother shakes her head. There's your dust. One strange but very real frontier problem involved lice spreading through bedding during long winters, when washing and fully drying blankets became nearly impossible. Families fought constant battles against insects, mildew, and odour while trapped indoors by storms and freezing temperatures. History books often say the pioneers endured hardship. They rarely specify that part of the hardship involves suspiciously moving blankets. The younger boy sits cross-legged near the hearth, poking gently at one drying boot. Smells funny. That's your foot, says the older girl immediately. The boy looks offended. The visiting father laughs quietly while rubbing warmth back into his hands. Outside, pale sunlight reflects blindingly off the fresh snow piled around the settlement. The storm has left the world sharp and glittering, almost beautiful enough to forget what the night felt like. Almost. The husband glances toward the buried cabins outside. Need checking after breakfast. The visiting father nods. Roofs too. Work waits patiently for no one. Researchers continue examining how frontier families manage sanitation during severe winters, when washing water froze quickly and drying fabric indoors became difficult or impossible. Spring cleaning carried enormous importance, partly because months of trapped dampness left cabins, bedding, and clothing saturated with smoke, mould, dirt, and lingering illness. You imagine the relief of the first warm spring day when blankets could finally hang outdoors beneath real sunlight instead of steaming endlessly beside fires. The woman begins folding the driest blankets carefully into neat stacks. Even now she sorts them by condition. Less damp, more damp, still freezing near the edges. One blanket unfolds suddenly, revealing old stitched repairs underneath. Different fabrics patched across the wool in crooked lines. The little rescue girl traces one seam gently with her finger. My grandma used dresses for patches. The visiting mother nods. Everybody did. The old man points towards another blanket hanging nearby. That one's got part of a curtain in it. The husband studies it. Huh, how can you tell? Still uglier than the rest. Even exhaustion cannot fully kill frontier sarcasm. One peculiar custom from some immigrant households involved storing lavender, cedar, or dried herbs inside folded quilts whenever possible to fight odors and insects during warmer months. By late winter, those pleasant smells usually surrendered completely to smoke, damp wool, and human existence. The younger boy suddenly holds up a stiff sock near the fire. It froze standing up. Everyone looks over. The sock indeed maintains an alarming amount of structure. The older girl bursts into laughter. Told you the floor was cold. The boy waves the sock dramatically like evidence in court. This ain't natural. The old man grins from beneath his blankets. Neither are frontier winters. Fair point again. The women finally persuade the old man to surrender one of his blankets for airing near the fire. He complains immediately. That one's warm. That one's wet, replies the woman. Wet can still be warm. That sentence feels like the entire story distilled into 6 words. A surprising number of pioneer letters and journals mention how strongly winter bedding smelled by the end of the season. Smoke embedded itself permanently into wool. Dampness added sourness. Sweat, spilled broth, wet boots, and years of use created odours. Modern cleaning products would attack with military enthusiasm, yet those same blankets also meant survival. The husband lifts another quilt experimentally. A tiny shower of ash falls from it into the firelight. Everyone stares. The visiting father laughs first. Well, he says, guess the settlement really did come inside with us. Nobody argues. Outside, the men eventually prepare to shovel paths toward neighbouring cabins buried after the storm. Inside, the women continue turning blankets towards sunlight creeping weakly through the windows. The little rescue girl yawns enormously beneath her borrowed quilt. You can keep sleeping, says the older child beside her. The younger girl nods instantly and curls back beneath the blankets without resistance. Honestly admirable. The cabin feels calmer now than at any point during the long night. Not cleaner, certainly not drier, but calmer. Steam rises gently from wool near the hearth. Children mumble sleepily beneath quilts. The fire crackles softly against the lingering smell of smoke and dampness. And while bright winter light spreads across snow-buried roofs outside, the battered blankets inside the cabin continue holding the memory of the storm in every heavy fold and frozen seam. By late morning, the storm has already begun turning into a story. That happens quickly on the frontier. A miserable night survives only briefly before somebody reshapes it into memory, humour, or warning. Perhaps people do this because they must. Endless hardship without storytelling would feel unbearable. The old man sits upright now, wrapped in 2 blankets, while warming his hands around a cup near the hearth. Daylight reveals deep lines across his face like cracks in old wood. You should have seen the winter of 49. He announces to no one in particular. The older girl groans immediately. Here we go. The little rescued child looks delighted instead. What happened? The old man lifts one finger dramatically. Snow clear past the windows. The husband snorts. You tell this different every year, because the snow keeps improving. The room laughs softly, and just like that, another brutal winter morning becomes entertainment. A recurring feature of frontier family life involved preserving hardship through storytelling. Diaries, letters, fireside tales, exaggerated weather comparisons. One generation survived terrible winters. The next generation heard about them while sitting comfortably beside better stoves, pretending not to be impressed. You suspect every century quietly edits its own suffering. The women continue folding blankets while listening with half attention. Some wool pieces finally feel almost dry now under the brighter daylight filtering through the cabin. Almost? Still cool underneath. Always underneath. The old man gestures broadly with his cup. Blankets froze stiff hanging over the bedposts. Had to beat snow off them every morning. The husband shakes his head. You're adding snow indoors now. There was plenty to spare. One strange but charming habit from many frontier families involved naming particularly terrible winters according to memorable disasters. The deep snow winter, the starving winter, the winter of blue milk. Harsh seasons became landmarks in family memory long after exact dates disappeared. The younger boy studies one patched quilt thoughtfully. Think people will remember this storm? The visiting father answers quietly. Depends if next one's worse. That feels like frontier wisdom distilled perfectly. Outside. Neighbours finally begin appearing between the drifts, moving slowly through shoveled paths across the buried settlement. Figures wrapped in coats and scarves call to one another through the cold air, while smoke rises from surviving chimneys. Life resumes almost immediately after danger passes. Someone checks roofs. Someone digs out a wagon. Someone curses frozen water buckets with creative spiritual intensity. The settlement exhales. Researchers continue exploring how memory transformed frontier hardship over generations. Descendants often recalled pioneer winters with pride and nostalgia, though original diaries sometimes reveal exhaustion, fear, loneliness, and frustration hidden beneath practical descriptions of daily survival. The older girl suddenly holds up one of the damp blankets dramatically. Imagine telling your grandchildren this smelled wonderful. The younger boy laughs. Maybe their noses freeze too. The old man points approvingly toward them. Now you're learning frontier history. One amusing little tradition in some rural communities involved airing blankets outdoors on bright winter days, even in freezing temperatures, because sunlight and fresh air supposedly sweetened wool. Sometimes the blankets froze into rigid boards instead, still counted as improvement apparently. The women finally carry several less damp blankets toward the doorway, where pale sunlight spills across the floorboards. Steam rises faintly from the wool as cold, fresh air brushes through the opening. The visiting mother closes her eyes briefly and breathes deeply. Smells better already. The husband glances around the cabin. That's because half the smell left with the children. The little rescue girl looks offended. We don't smell. The older girl answers instantly. We absolutely do. Children everywhere remain refreshingly honest. You watch sunlight strike the hanging blankets near the doorway. Tiny bits of ash still cling to the fibres from the burned cabins outside. Last night's disaster now hangs quietly beside drying wool and morning conversation. The younger boy suddenly points toward the scorched blanket from earlier. That one almost killed us. No, says the old man calmly. The dead one almost inconvenienced us severely. Another fair frontier distinction. A number of settlers reportedly saved badly damaged blankets for decades afterward, because replacing them cost too much, or because the blankets carried memories of difficult journeys, fires, storms, and survival. Objects became family history long before museums decided they were important. The husband lifts the scorched corner carefully. Still usable. Everyone nods automatically. Of course it is. Nothing gets discarded lightly here. Outside. The buried settlement glitters painfully bright beneath the snow. Yet smoke rises from chimneys again. Paths reappear slowly between cabins. Somewhere nearby an axe begins chopping frozen wood with steady ringing blows. The storm already belongs partly to the past. Inside, the old man continues embellishing older winter stories while children listen with delighted suspicion. The women fold blankets into neat worn stacks. The men prepare to check neighbouring cabins before the next night arrives, and through the lingering smell of smoke and damp wool, you begin noticing something strange. The misery of the night has softened slightly already. Not disappeared, not improved, just softened around the edges by warmth, memory, and shared survival. Perhaps that is how frontier winters endured inside family stories for generations afterward. The cold slowly faded first, then the exhaustion, then the fear, but the blankets remained, heavy, damp, smoke-scented, and forever tied to the long frozen nights people somehow survived together. The morning settles gently over the buried settlement. Not warm, never warm, but calmer now. Sunlight glitters across the snowdrifts outside so brightly it almost hurts to look at them. Smoke rises in thin grey ribbons from surviving chimneys. Somewhere beyond the cabin, axes strike frozen wood in slow, steady rhythms, while voices drift between the cleared paths. Life continues. That may be the most important frontier skill of all. Inside the cabin, the blankets have finally stopped dripping. Some still hang near the rafters, drying in pale winter light. Others lie folded beside the wall, patched and smoke-scented and carrying the weight of the night inside their heavy wool fibres. You run one hand slowly across the nearest blanket, still damp underneath. Of course, certain things on the frontier never fully dried. Not boots, not walls, not exhaustion. The women prepare a small breakfast beside the hearth while children shuffle sleepily through the cramped room wrapped in quilts like wandering little ghosts. The younger boy still complains dramatically about frozen floorboards. The older girl mocks him with sisterly dedication. The little rescued child laughs more easily now. The old man watches all of it from his corner beneath two blankets and one permanently suspicious expression. "Storm's done," he mutters. The husband glances toward the buried world outside. "Till next week?" That answer feels accurate enough. A well-documented aspect of frontier winter life was how quickly families returned to ordinary work after dangerous storms passed. Animals still required feeding, roofs needed clearing, water had to be hauled, fires maintained. Survival left very little time for emotional recovery. The visiting father finally stands near the doorway, pulling on boots that remain only slightly less wet than yesterday. "Need to dig out our chimney before tonight." The women exchange tired looks at that sentence. Tonight, another night already waiting. One delightful little frontier belief claimed particularly old quilts, absorbed memories from the people sleeping beneath them. Weddings, illnesses, births, storms, arguments, laughter. By that logic, the blankets hanging in this cabin must feel emotionally exhausted. The husband lifts the scorched blanket from beside the hearth and studies the burned corner thoughtfully. "Still good," he says again. The old man snorts softly. "Everything's still good till it falls apart in your hands." Perhaps that is frontier optimism too. Not pretending conditions are comfortable, simply deciding broken things remain useful anyway. Researchers continue reflecting on how modern memory reshaped frontier hardship into simpler stories about rugged independence. Yet the reality inside cabins like this was often quieter and more intimate. Shared warmth, shared fear, shared blankets passed between tired hands during freezing nights. No one survived entirely alone. The children eventually crowd near the doorway, watching sunlight blaze across the snow outside. The younger boy squints dramatically. "Bright enough to blind somebody." "Already happened to your father once," says the old man. The husband groans. Can we stop telling that story? No. Apparently frontier settlements preserved embarrassment with excellent archival dedication. The women begin carrying blankets outdoors one at a time to air briefly in the weak sunlight. Steam rises from the wool as cold fresh air brushes across it. The fabric no longer smells quite so heavy now. Smoke remains. Dampness remains. But something cleaner has arrived too. "Morning." You step closer to the doorway and look across the settlement. Snow covers nearly everything. Burned cabins crouch dark beneath drifting white ash. Chimneys stand crooked against the bright sky. Shoveled paths wind slowly between homes where people already work despite exhaustion. And everywhere you look, blankets, hanging from fences, spread across wagon rails, draped over shoulders, wrapped around children. A frontier winter leaves its mark most clearly in cloth. One final historical observation lingers quietly beside you now. Many surviving blankets from 19th century frontier families still exist today in museums, trunks, and family collections. Faded quilts, smoke-stained wool, carefully patched bedding carried across storms and generations alike. Modern visitors often admire the stitching. Few notice the memory of cold hidden inside them. The old man shifts beside the fire and closes his eyes again. Sun'll drop fast tonight. Nobody answers immediately because everyone knows he's right. Winter always returns. Still, the room feels gentler now than during the long dark hours before dawn. The children laugh quietly together. The visitors prepare to return home. The women fold blankets with calmer hands. The men discuss roofs, fences, wood piles, and weather in low, familiar voices. Ordinary life resumes beside extraordinary cold. And slowly, very slowly, the sharp edges of the night begin softening. The memory of damp wool against freezing skin drifts farther away. The fear of sparks near hanging blankets fades into story. The sound of coughing children becomes softer now beneath daylight and warmth. Even the storm itself feels more distant already, as if the snow outside has begun covering the memory along with the roads. You sit quietly near the fire one last time while the cabin breathes around you. Smoke curls lazily upward. Blankets sway gently overhead. Sunlight rests pale against the frost-marked walls. And beyond the little frontier cabin, winter stretches endlessly across the frozen American landscape. Cold and patient and strangely beautiful in its silence. For now, though, inside these walls, the fire still burns, the blankets still hold warmth, and the people beneath them remain together,